Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, everything else in between, everyone else, because you're human too. Speaking of questionable humans, I got an episode for you guys today. Oh my. This may be a long one, letting y'all know now. Today's topic, discussing Kenneth Grant and the Typhonian Tradition, here on Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Luck. Without further ado, because this probably is going to be a long one, let's just jump right into it. Come on! There's a story that Kenneth Grant supposedly liked to tell about his first meeting with Aleister Crowley. It was 1944. Grant was 19 years old, living in London during the Blitz, and already obsessed with the occult. He wrote to Crowley, the most infamous magician in the world at that time, and self-styled Great Beast 666. That's what he sounded like. And to his shock, that's what Crowley sounded like. And to his shock, to Grant's shock, received an invitation to come and visit. Presumably not for sex. Presumably. Grant arrived at the address to find Crowley burning papers in a fireplace. The older man looked up and said, "You're late." Grant apologized, explaining the difficulty of wartime travel, which I'm sure Crowley had no appreciation for. Crowley waved it off, and he said, "Not for this meeting, for the last one in 1875. Crowley was born in 1875. Now, this is how Grant told it. This is how he supposedly lived his entire life. As if time weren't a straight line, but a spiral. Time is a flat circle. As if he were remembering the future and forgetting the past in equal measure. Normally we call that senility, but when the occult is involved, things take on a different shade. He'd spend the next 6 decades of his life building a magical system so dense and so deliberately unsettling for some, that even hardened occultists approach it with caution. He called it the Typhonian Tradition, and he claimed it was older than humanity itself. Kenneth Grant was born in 1924 in Ilford, Essex. His childhood was, by his own account, saturated with the paranormal. He claimed to have experienced spontaneous astral projections as young as 8 years old, waking up floating above his body, watching himself sleep, then snapping back into his body with a sensation like falling. He reported seeing entities in his bedroom, shadows that moved with intention, as well as figures that stood at the foot of his bed and communicated without speaking. Whether these were genuine experiences or the fabrications of a man who would spend the rest of his life selling mysticism is unclear. But what's documented is that by his teens, Grant was already deeply embedded in London's occult underground. He joined the Golden Dawn offshoots, the various Stella Matutina temples that were limping along in the 1930s and 40s. He studied Kabbalah not as a Jewish mystic might, but as a system of psychological architecture, a map of consciousness disguised as a map of God. Or is it a map of God disguised as a map of consciousness? The world may never know. The war interrupted everything. Grant was called up and served briefly, and ultimately discharged for medical reasons. The official records say psychological instability. Not the Kenny I know. Grant would later claim that the military doctors had detected something in him, some quality of mind that made him unstable for ordinary service. He preferred to believe he was already too far gone into the mauve zone. I'm not going to do it like that every time, because it gets brought up so many times this episode that I don't have the tolerance to do it every time. So, good for both of us. But the mauve zone, that liminal space between waking and dream, to remain functional amongst consensus reality. In 1944, he made contact with Crowley. This wasn't a casual correspondence. Crowley was in the final years of his life, living in Hastings, impoverished and addicted to heroin, but still somewhat mentally formidable. He recognized something in Grant, a willingness to go further than most, magically, but also sexually, presumably, to embrace the aspects of magic that Crowley himself had only ever hinted at in his published works. Grant became Crowley's personal secretary. That's what they called it in those days. The job description was euphemistic. What Grant actually did was manage the day-to-day survival of a dying, heroin-addicted magician, curing drugs, handling correspondence, fending off predators, and, most importantly, receiving magical instruction. Crowley taught him the techniques of sex magic, the methods of invocation and evocation, the secret alphabets and their hidden correspondences. But he also taught him something else, that magic works. That the entities contacted and rituals aren't psychological constructs, but independent intelligences. That the universe isn't empty, but rather crowded, filled with forces that predate human consciousness and will most definitely outlast it. Crowley died in 1947. Grant was 23 years old. He had inherited, if not the kingdom itself, at least the keys to the gate. In 1952, Kenneth Grant met the future Mrs. Steffi Grant, born Stella Bursill. It's a big change. She was an artist, model, and, according to both of them, already psychically sensitive. Their meeting was, by their account, predestined. Steffi had been having dreams of a man she would later identify as Kenneth before they ever even met. Kenneth claimed to have been instructed by his quote-unquote secret chiefs, the astral masters who guide the true initiates, to find her. What followed was one of the most intense magical partnerships of the 20th century. Kenneth and Steffi got married, and she became not just his wife, but his primary magical working partner, his muse, and, according to some who knew them, his medium. Somewhat lending credence to that old Marshall McLuhan adage, the medium is the message. The Steffi working became the foundation of the Typhonian system. It was a series of rituals performed over several years in the 1950s designed to open what Grant called the Mauve Zone. I'm going to make a liar out of myself. A region of consciousness beyond the standard Kabalistic tree of life, beyond even the abyss that separates the manifest from the unmanifest. The Mauve Zone was Grant's innovation. See, not that time. His addition to occult cartography. It was a place where Typhonian currents flowed, the primal force of destruction and creation that predates the ordered cosmos. The rituals involved heavy use of sex magic, of course. Crowley had pioneered the use of sexual energy as a magical force, but Grant pushed it even further, into territories that made even Crowley's more conservative followers uncomfortable. Made them uncomfortable. The Steffi working involved what Grant called, quote, the formula of the 11-fold word, unquote. A technique of simultaneous orgasm and visualization designed to open gateways in the fabric of reality. But it wasn't just sex. The working allegedly produced phenomena that bordered on the horror movie surreal. Steffi reported being ridden, R-I-D-D-E-N, like past tense of rodin, by entities, taken over completely, speaking in voices not her own, producing knowledge she couldn't have possessed otherwise. Objects moved in their ritual space. There were manifestations of shadows that detached from walls and moved independently, sounds of breathing in empty rooms, and the smell of rotting flowers and ozone. There's that ozone smell again. Very odd, very odd. The most disturbing account comes from a visitor to their London flat in 1956. This is a young occultist who had been corresponding with Grant and who was invited to witness a working. He arrived to find the apartment transformed, every mirror covered in black cloth, the windows painted over, the air thick with incense that made him nauseous. Kenneth and Steffi were already in a trance state, moving in a synchronized dance that seemed to have no beginning or end. I'm assuming he just walked in, they just left the door open for him if they were mid-trance. The witness reported that the temperature dropped drastically, that the shadows in the corners of the room grew darker and denser until they seemed to be absorbing light rather than blocking it. Then he heard a sound like wet leather being stretched. Ugh. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And that Steffi turned to look at him with eyes that were completely black. No whites, no iris, just black. And spoke a sentence in a language he didn't recognize, which Grant later translated as, quote, "The gate is open. Will you enter?" unquote. Oh, wiki. The witness fled. Probably a correct response in that situation. He'd later write about the experience, describing it as the most terrifying night of his life. He claimed that for weeks afterward, he was followed by shadows that moved when he wasn't looking directly at them, that he woke up with scratches on his body that he couldn't explain, or that he heard whispering within white noise. Grant was delighted by this report. He published it more or less verbatim in his first major work. For him, the terror was the point. Magic that didn't disturb, that didn't challenge the fundamental assumptions of reality, was merely psychology. True magic, the Typhonian current, was dangerous. And it was supposed to be dangerous. When the magical revival debuted in 1972, it fundamentally shattered the dry academic approach to 20th century esotericism. Rather than delivering a standard historical retrospective, Grant structured the book as a highly technical, comparative blueprint mapping out a primal pre-Christian current that he claims survived centuries of systemic suppression. The book is organized into distinct thematic chapters that trace this hidden path. The Left-Hand Path and Vama-Marg, or Vama-Marga, Grant extensively incorporates Eastern mysticism, bridging Western ceremonial magic with the Indian Tantra tradition. Specifically, the Vama-Marga, or Left-Hand Path. He introduced the concept of starfire, decoding the precise use of physiological and endocrinological secretions in ritual sex magic. Now, to put that in the most plain, out in the open terms as I possibly can, it's various concoctions, if you will, of seminal fluid and menses. What it is. The Draconian and Typhonian lineage. He maps a legacy traveling from the dark dynasties of ancient Egypt through the Sumerian cult of Shaitan. In Grant's view, Typhon, the dark mother of Egyptian lore, and Set were not forces of evil, but primordial archetypes of consciousness and gateways to cosmic intelligence. There's the synthesis of modern adepts. Grant dedicating significant space to synthesizing the methods of three foundational modern figures. Crowley, who was positioned as the vehicle who revived the concentrated current, though Grant argues Crowley subconsciously masked or was holding back its ultimate implications. There's Austin Osman Spare. Grant introduces Spare's Zos Kia Cultus and the mechanics of the death posture to the broader occult public, validating Spare's sorcery alongside Crowley's high ceremonialism. And Dion's Fortune. He analyzes her work with psychic self-defense and the lunar currents of modern witchcraft. In arguably the most radical chapter of the book, gnarly, Grant presents his theory that horror author H.P. Lovecraft was an unconscious psychic medium. He demonstrates that Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos perfectly mirrors Crowley's Book of the Law, suggesting both men were tapping into the exact same transdimensional forces. To understand the intense paranormal climate surrounding the writing of the magical revival, one just needs to look slightly backwards into the immediate years preceding it, specifically his work with the New Isis Lodge, which ran from 1954 to 1962, and his ongoing domestic operations in Golders Green, North London. Grant operated under the firm belief that the cosmos was transmitting a specialized energy from a trans-Plutonic power zone, or Trans-Yuggothian, if you're freaky, known as New Isis. The rituals conducted to channel this Sirius set current resulted in heavy clusters of documented high strangeness and psychic anomalies. During this era of intensive ritual practice, Grant and his wife Steffi documented numerous instances where physical space seemed to warp. In the lodge's central London basement workings, participants frequently reported dense, sudden drops in ambient temperature, profound temporal distortions, and the localized manifestations of visual anomalies. Grant heavily focused on Lamb, the bulbous-headed extraterrestrial intelligence that Crowley originally sketched in 1917-1918, depending on the source. Grant claimed that through specific meditative and sexual magical formulas, Lamb functioned as a physical interdimensional doorway, resulting in vivid shared telepathic contact among the lodge members. Because Grant worked closely as an, amanuensis, A-M-A-N-U-E-N-S-I-S, which is essentially a person employed to write down what another dictates or to copy what's been written by another. Basically, it's a literary or artistic assistant, such as a secretary, scribe, or copyist who takes down dictation, transcribes notes, or copies manuscripts on behalf of another person. And as a companion to Austin Osman Spare until Spare's death in 1956. He inherited a deep practical knowledge of Spare's atavistic resurgence, the art of awakening primal animalistic consciousness deep within the human psyche. Grant asserted that during several invocations meant to project thought forms similar to tulpas, the atmosphere in his home became physically heavy, accompanied by the distinct scratching sounds of invisible claws and the brief, fleeting materialization of monstrous, shifting shadows on the walls, reminiscent of the elemental familiars that Spare used to draw. The sheer volatility of the Typhonian current often manifested as classic poltergeist-style phenomena. In his correspondences, Grant noted that the physical seals and the talismans painted for rituals would occasionally degrade or fracture under the strain of the energy being directed. Fellow occultists who interacted with Grant during this preparatory phase, leading into the late 1960s, often expressed deep unease regarding his personal magical sigil, Aossic, Aossic, claiming that merely observing or concentrating on the design induced severe vertigo, acute physical nausea, and intense, vivid nightmares of being lost in non-Euclidean space. The magical revival was ultimately designed to do exactly what its title implied: pull occultism out of Victorian-era morality and realign it with raw cosmic reality. By explicitly linking ancient sorcery, modern sex magic, and cosmic horror, Grant laid the groundwork for what would soon evolve into chaos magic, the Temple of Set, and the entire modern landscape of left-hand path occultism. His next book, Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God, 1974, represents the transition from Kenneth Grant's revisionist history into his fully formed, operative metaphysical system. If the magical revival was the manifesto, then the Hidden God was the specialized technical manual, deeply embedding left-hand path Tantra directly into the structure of Western ceremonial magic. The core concepts introduced and expanded upon with the book include Set as Set the God, the Egyptian god, as the extraterrestrial hidden god. Grant strips the Egyptian deity Set of any simplistic Judeo-Christian satanic framework. He defines Set as a primordial, non-human intelligence, the ultimate archetype of the outsider. Set is the consciousness of the void that existed before the cosmos was structured into light and order, making him an initiatory gateway to forces completely exterior to human evolution. Technically, Set is also another facet of Yahweh. If you consider the Egyptians using Set as the god of foreigners, and the Israeli people, or the people of Israel, whatever they were called back then, the Judaic people, the Hebrews, their god was a foreign god, so technically Jehovah or Yahweh or whatever and Set, it's an argument to be made. Anywho, the mechanics of the new Isis and sexual kalas were another major component. A massive portion of the text is dedicated to a highly detailed analysis of the kalas, the subtle vaginal manifestations and psychosexual secretions generated during specific phases of the female lunar cycle. I'm just reporting the news. Grant argues that when a magician works with a consecrated ritual partner, or scarlet woman, or a suvasini in Tantra, these kalas act as physical, chemical conductors capable of anchoring the extraterrestrial transmissions of the Typhonian current into the physical world. There's the Qliphoth and the night side of Eden. Grant introduces his definitive interpretation of the Qliphoth, the shells or husks of the Kabalistic tree of life. Rather than treating the Qliphoth as a dangerous psychological trash heap to be avoided, Grant positions the tree of death as the true, unconditioned reality. To access it, an adept must travel backwards through the tunnels of the shadow tree, a process of inverse creation that dissolves the mundane ego to tap into raw cosmic energy. And then, of course, there's the Mauve Zone. Grant explicitly conceptualizes the Mauve Zone as a volatile, twilight borderland of consciousness. It's the non-spatial intersection where the human subconscious directly collides with the vast extra-dimensional outer space of the great old ones. It acts as a necessary buffer. Without mastering the Mauve Zone, a magician attempting to contact these alien intelligences would face total psychological shatter. The period surrounding the writing and publication of Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God coincided with intense, highly concentrated ritual experimentation. As Grant began formally mapping the tunnels of the Qliphoth, the physical environment around his magical working groups began to exhibit severe localized anomalies. During the early 1970s, Grant and his inner circle performed complex invocations using the exact psychosexual kala formulas outlined in the book. Participants frequently documented a phenomenon described as the oozing, or localized density shift, of the room's atmosphere. Witnesses claimed that the air in the ritual chamber would become perceptually thick, accompanied by an intense scent resembling musk and ozone. On multiple occasions, the shadows in the corners of the room would move independent of any light source, and they would stretch outwards, briefly mimicking the elongated canine features of the set animal before dissolving back into the woodwork. Now, while the set animal isn't quite pegged down on, I think there are several interpretations, one being a donkey, or a donkey or a mule or a jackass. What else? There's an anteater or a tapir, I believe they're called. And then there's some people who said it's a dog, a cynocephalous creature. I think the closest Egyptian animal that was often equated was the mandrill or baboon, one or the other, or an ape that looked very similar to those particular species. The heavy focus on capturing extraterrestrial vibrations led to strange interactions with contemporary technology. Grant and his close collaborators reported that audio recording devices used to document ritual dictations or backmasking experiments would frequently pick up rhythmic, mechanical clicking sounds and low-frequency hums that couldn't be traced to any local interference. Grant maintained that these were physical sonic bleed-throughs from the Mauve Zone, the acoustic byproduct of transdimensional entities attempting to synchronize with human recording media. The specific sigils and Kabalistic diagrams drawn for the Hidden God carried a distinct psychic weight that affected individuals outside of the immediate rituals. Typesetters, publishers, and early proofreaders involved with the 1974 manuscript reported a bizarre contagion of sleep paralysis, vivid nightmares of falling through infinite black voids, and sudden bouts of acute spatial vertigo while handling the chapters concerning the Qliphoth. Grant viewed this not as a curse, but as a natural automatic defense mechanism of the text, the objective reality of the Typhonian current radiating through the printed words itself. In Cults of the Shadow, 1975, Grant completed his first Typhonian Trilogy, shifting from the foundational history of the Western esoteric tradition toward a radical global synthesis of the left-hand path. His overarching thesis was that what mainstream society vilified as black magic was actually a misunderstood, primordial transmission of cosmic power, the Ophidian or snake current, that tracks back to pre-monumental Egyptian and West African fetish systems. Rather than suppressing the chaotic, subconscious, and sexual dimensions of the psyche, the groups Grant studied actively harnessed them to achieve cosmic consciousness. Grant argued that the true will or hidden God of humanity is constantly accompanied by a shadow or astral twin. By mapping the left-hand path, he sought to show how various esoteric groups preserved the ancient pre-Christian worship of the divine feminine and the stellar/draconian deities associated with Set, Typhon, and the dark of the moon. He traced this through the Vamamarga, focusing on the Suvasinis or female initiates who act as human conduits for the Kundalini or fire snake, through Gnosticism and the Templars, reinterpreting their heretical rites, quote-unquote heretical rites, not as devil worship, but as the preservation of non-dual, light-bringing Ophidian gnosis. His words, not mine. European witch cults and Austin Osman Spare being another primary aspect, examining how Spare's Zoskia occultists utilized specialized sigil sorcery and atavistic resurgence to unlock the deep subconscious. Cults of the Shadow is highly notable for bridging historical folklore with contemporary 20th century occultism. Grant dedicated significant portions of the text to aligning Aleister Crowley's Cult of the Beast and the Scarlet Woman with the bizarre multidimensional work of Michael Bertaux. Grant introduced the wider reading public to Bertaux's Chicago-based La Couleuvre Noire, or the Black Snake, and the Neo-Pythagorean Gnostic Church, which fused Franco-Haitian Voodoo with esoteric Kabbalah and deep space metaphysics. Anyone out there who's never at least perused the book, the Voodoo Gnostic Workbook, my goodness. Boy, that is just a gumbo of high strangeness. It's definitely worth checking out. Grant's writing process wasn't just academic. Oh, no. It was treated as an active invocation. The era surrounding the research, writing, and late 1975 publishing of The Cults of the Shadow was marked by intense high strangeness experienced by Grant, his wife Steffi, and members of his New Isis Lodge. Because the book deals heavily with the doppelganger, the shade, and the astral double, the physical environment around the Grants reportedly became highly unstable. During the curation of the book's iconic artwork, most notably Steffi Grant's dust jacket piece titled Lycanthropy, the couple and their close circle reported intense ambient objective phenomena. This included sudden drops in temperature, the auditory sound of phantom animals and heavy breathing or panting in closed rooms, and brief glimpses of spectral beasts or phantom hyenas and wolves, manifesting in the twilight shadows of their workspace. During this phase, Grant was actively processing the magical records of the New Isis Lodge, which ran until 1962, to formulate his theories. The Lodge had focused on opening a direct gateway to a trans-plutonic power zone called New Isis, NU-ISIS. You'll see alternative spellings, N-E-W, new, with New Isis, N-U. New is, I believe, his personal spelling alteration of Nuit, the Egyptian goddess of night. I may be wrong on that, but I think that's what he's going for. Grant claimed that during the drafting of the chapters on Crowley's Liber Al and Bertaux's Voodoo Gnostic Currents, the physical manuscript pages themselves seemed to act as talismans. Members of his inner circle reported experiencing severe psychological displacement, dream control anomalies, where their sleeping states were hijacked by non-human intelligences, and localized electrical malfunctions within their meeting spaces. Grant firmly believed that the left-hand path was the quickest way to puncture the veil of the material universe, but warned it was incredibly dangerous if the energies weren't properly polarized. While deep in the research of Bertaux's Black Snake Current, Grant documented instances of atavistic resurgence, where practitioners unconsciously channeled ancient predatory consciousness or experienced sudden, violent poltergeist-like activity in their immediate vicinity. The book ultimately stands as a monument to this period, where the barrier between surrealist art, fringe ufology/cosmic horror, and classical occult practices completely dissolved for the Typhonian OTO. And he was looking for something else. Evidence of contact with non-human intelligences. This is where this particular aspect of all his work really comes into being. It becomes a major through line to all of his work from this point on. Grant believed that the Typhonian current originated outside of Earth, that it was a transmission from trans-Plutonic or Trans-Yuggothian forces from entities dwelling in the outer darkness beyond Neptune. And this wasn't a metaphor for Grant. He believed that magic was a technology for receiving and transmitting signals across vast distances, and that the human nervous system could be tuned like a radio to pick up broadcasts from alien consciousness. The books were dense, to say the least. Man, he'll launch into all this Kabalistic gematria word number play, and I just, personally, I cannot stand that shit. But that's just me. That's just me. I don't put much stock and all that kind of stuff. The books were dense, deliberately weird as all get out, and filled with references to obscure texts and unpublished manuscripts. So some of the citing some of the sources can be a little iffy. Like, so-and-so wrote this, but they never published it. So, They were also, for those who could penetrate them, genuinely disturbing. Grant was most definitely not writing self-help. He was writing a manual for contacting forces that he believed were actively hostile to human life as we know it. By the mid-1970s, Grant had formally broken with the OTO, the organization that Crowley had led. The OTO considered him a heretic. He considered them cowards who'd abandoned the great work for social respectability. He founded his own organization, the Typhonian Order, later renamed the Typhonian Ordo Templei Orientis, to deliberately confuse the issue. The Typhonian Order was never large. At its peak, it probably had fewer than 100 active members worldwide, but it was intense. What they lacked in numbers, they made up for in intensity. Grant demanded total commitment, total secrecy, and a willingness to undergo experiences that would break most people. The initiations involved prolonged periods of isolation, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and the systematic dismantling of the candidate's sense of identity. And they involved contact. This was the point that Grant kept returning to. Magic wasn't about self-improvement or psychological integration. It was about contact with the other, with the quote-unquote masters who dwelt in the Mauve Zone, with the transplutonic forces, with the entities that had been called gods but were really something else entirely, something that predated human evolution and would survive human extinction. The 1970s and 80s were the peak period of Grant's active magical work. He and Steffi had moved to a house in Golders Green, London, which became the headquarters of the Typhonian Order. The house itself became a character in the story, a building where, according to multiple witnesses, the walls seemed to breathe. Doors opened into rooms that shouldn't exist, and time moved differently depending on which floor you were on. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from a series of workings performed in 1978, which Grant referred to only as the Black Snake Operation. According to documents that have circulated amongst occult researchers, this was an attempt to materialize a specific entity, something Grant called the Naga of the Deep, a serpent being that supposedly guarded one of the tunnels leading into the Mauve Zone. The working lasted for 11 days. It involved a group of 7 initiates, including Grant and his wife, performing synchronized rituals at specific times. They used a combination of traditional techniques, mantras, visualizations, sexual energy, etc., and something that Austin Osman Spare had called the death posture, a physical position designed to simulate death and trigger out-of-body experiences. On the 7th day, something went wrong. According to the accounts written by one of the participants, who left the order immediately after and refused to discuss this for decades, the group had succeeded in opening a gateway, but they couldn't close it. The entity they'd contacted wasn't the Naga, but something else, something that identified itself only as the Hunger. No, it wasn't me. The participant reported that the temperature in the room dropped below freezing despite the summer heat outside, that the candles froze with the wax solidifying in mid-drip, that Steffi Grant began speaking in a voice that wasn't her own, offering the group quote-unquote gifts that included impossible knowledge, secrets about their past that no one could have known, and predictions of their future that would later come true with disturbing accuracy. And then the physical manifestations began. The participant described seeing, quote, a darkness that had weight and texture, unquote, emerging from the corners of the room. It moved like a liquid, flowing across the floor and up the walls. It smelled of ammonia and rotting meat. It touched one of the initiates, a man named David, who's never been fully identified, and he began screaming. Not in fear, the participant emphasized, but in pain, as if something were being physically extracted from his body. The working was aborted, and Grant performed an emergency banishing ritual that took hours. David survived what was reportedly never the same. He became withdrawn, stopped speaking, and eventually vanished from occult circles entirely. The participants claimed that for months afterward, All 7 of the working group experienced shared nightmares, dreams of being underground in tunnels that went down forever, and being pursued by something that made sounds like wet leather and broken glass. Grant considered the working a partial success. Grant considered the working a partial success. In his private notes, later published posthumously, he wrote, quote, "We touched the current. We proved it flows. The danger is the proof." Unquote. No red flags there. Nope. No siree, Bob. There were other incidents. The Red Room working of 1981, where participants reported that the walls began bleeding, a physical impossibility that Grant attributed to, quote, etheric condensation, unquote. There was the Mirror working of 1983, where Steffi allegedly contacted an entity that claimed to be her own future self, who'd come back to warn her about Kenneth's impending death, which finally occurred in 2011. So I ask you, where's the trust? The Sleeper working of 1985, where a volunteer was put into a trance state for 3 days and emerged speaking a language that linguists couldn't identify, describing a civilization that existed before the moon, quote-unquote, before the moon. Now, quick-ear listeners may be wondering, quote, if they couldn't understand him, then how the hell did they know what he was describing? Well, there's an app for that, an application of occult logic. In the inner circles of the Typhonian OTO, this paradox is usually explained by a mix of glossolalia, or speaking tongues, as well as a beautiful name for a baby, automatic writing, and telepathic translation. The following is exactly how Kenneth Grant and his lodge members claimed they bypassed the language barrier during the sleeper working. There's the medium's double channeling. The volunteer wasn't just screaming unintelligible syllables into the void for 3 days and nights. According to the ritual logs, the sleeper would drift between 2 distinct phases, a deep vocal trance state where they uttered the unknowable phonetic root sounds, quote-unquote, of the primordial civilization, and a secondary, lighter trance state where their consciousness acted as an interpreter, translating the concepts into English or recording them via automatic writing. There's also the use of telepathy, apparently. Grant firmly believed that the true transmission of magical knowledge doesn't rely on spoken words, but on direct mind-to-mind impression. While the sleeper's physical vocal cords were firing off a language, quote, without known syntax, unquote, the magicians sitting in the circle, who were themselves deeply altered on, quote-unquote, ritual incenses and ceremonial focus, claimed to receive simultaneous nonverbal mental downloads, or psychic impressions that detailed the specific history of this pre-lunar civilization. There's also the use of post hoc Kabbalah and gematria. When the sleeper woke up, they didn't just go back to their day job. The lodge compiled the phonetic fragments that were recorded during the 3-day operation and analyzed them using complex esoteric tools like gematria and alphanumeric codes, as well as Crowley's 777 correspondences, a table of correspondences. By matching the bizarre root sounds to ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, or Egyptian occult syllables, Grant, quote-unquote, decoded the narrative about the civilization before the moon. Basically, they leaned heavily on the idea that the spirit of the message was perfectly clear, even if the vocabulary was entirely alien. Okay. These stories circulated in occult circles. Some are certainly exaggerations or fabrications, but the consistency of the witnesses, multiple people reporting similar phenomena independently before Grant published his accounts, is somewhat suggestive. Something was happening in that house in Golders Green, something that left people changed, sometimes broken, or occasionally enlightened, quote-unquote, in ways that made them unable to function in normal society. Grant's attitude towards these dangers was complex. On one hand, he warned his students constantly. The Typhonian current was not safe. The forces it contacted were not benevolent. The goal was not happiness or peace, but knowledge, gnosis. And the price of knowledge was often sanity, health, or life. On the other hand, he seemed to delight in the risks, but a sociopath. The more dangerous the working, the more valuable the results. I can kind of understand the logic behind that. Magic that didn't cost something wasn't real magic. You don't get something for nothing. This was the philosophy that would drive him into his most controversial work, the full exploration of the night side, the Qliphoth, and the tunnels that led beyond human consciousness entirely. By 1977, Kenneth Grant had established himself as the most feared and respected occultist in Britain. Feared because his magic actually seemed to work, producing experiences that couldn't be explained away as psychology or coincidence. Respected because his knowledge was encyclopedic, his dedication absolute, and his willingness to go where others wouldn't extreme. He'd also established a pattern that would continue for the rest of his life. Every few years, he would publish a book that expanded the Typhonian system further into territory that made even hardened occultists uncomfortable. Made them feel uncomfortable. The second trilogy, which Grant called the Trilogies of the Night Side, would take his work from merely controversial to genuinely transgressive. Night Side of Eden, 1977, was the book that changed everything. It was Grant's exploration of the Qliphoth, the husks or the shells of the Kabalistic tradition, the demonic counterparts to the angelic forces of the Tree of Life. But Grant wasn't interested in the standard demonology. He was more interested in what lay beyond the Qliphoth, in the spaces between the shells, and the tunnels that connected the night side to the day side and beyond both the Mauve Zone. The book introduced Grant's most disturbing concept, that the forces of the night side weren't evil in any human moral sense, but they were antithetical to human life. They were the forces of uncreation, of entropy, of the void that existed before creation and would exist after it ended. Contacting them was dangerous not because they would punish you for sin, but because they simply didn't care about human existence. To them, we were temporary configurations of matter, no more significant than clouds or dust devils. And yet, Grant argued these were the forces that true magicians needed to contact. The quote-unquote white magic of the Golden Dawn, the right-hand path of conventional spirituality, these were dead ends, systems designed to keep human consciousness safely contained within illusory boundaries. Real magic, Typhonian magic, required breaking those boundaries, stepping outside the circles of time and space, and facing whatever lays beyond. Night Side of Eden presented a system of magical exploration based on the 22 paths of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, but inverted, reversed, turned inside out, topsy-turvy, cattywampus, if you will. Where the Tree of Life led upward toward divine unity, Grant's Tree of Death led downward and outward, toward multiplicity, the alien, the other, and into the void. He called these paths the tunnels of Set. Set being the Egyptian god of chaos, the murderer of Osiris, the lord of the Red Desert. Each tunnel was guarded by a specific entity, a Qliphothic force, that had to be confronted and integrated. The magician's goal was to traverse all 22 tunnels, gotta get them all, to map the night side completely, and to emerge into the Mauve Zone beyond. The book provided detailed instructions for these explorations, the specific drugs that facilitated the journeys, the sexual techniques that opened the gateways, and the mantras and visualizations that allowed the magician to navigate them. It was a manual for psychonauts, but the territory being explored wasn't the personal unconscious. It was something that Grant believed was objectively real, a dimension that existed whether humans perceived it or not. The response to Night Side of Eden was polarizing. Some readers recognized it as a masterpiece of occult literature, a genuine expansion of the possible, a map of territories previously uncharted. Others saw it as dangerous nonsense, a recipe for madness disguised as spirituality. A few, those who tried the techniques, reported experiences that confirmed Grant's claims. They reported encounters with entities that defied description, journeys through spaces that didn't follow Euclidean geometry, and returns to their body that left them questioning whether they had ever left or whether their ordinary lives were the real hallucination. While Orthodox Kabbalah treats the Tree of Life as a blueprint for divine emanation and spiritual ascent, Grant posited that this structure casts a cosmic shadow. This shadow world is the Sitra Achra, I think that's how you say it, the other side, or the Tree of Death. Where the front of the tree represents order, light, and the restriction of ego to achieve unity with a singular god, the night side represents the primordial chaos that existed before creation. Traversing it isn't an act of destruction, but of cosmic archaeology, reclaiming the primal chaotic current of the universe, the Typhonian or Ophidian current, to transcend the material matrix altogether. Grant adapted Crowley's obscure work in Liber 231 to argue that the 22 paths connecting the Sephiroth have dark, inverted counterparts. He named these the Tunnels of Set. Crucially, Grant emphasized that these tunnels aren't mere metaphors for psychological complexes or the personal subconscious. He insisted that they're objectively real, extra-dimensional conduits inhabited by autonomous, non-human intelligences. To enter a tunnel is to physically shift one's consciousness into an alien ecology that operates on non-Euclidean geometry and alternate physical laws. The ultimate objective of navigating these paths is to break through the universe of structured matter and cross into the Mauve Zone. Grant defined this as a mystical twilight threshold state, a zone where the human ego completely dissolves and the sorcerer can commune directly with extraterrestrial and transdimensional entities, such as those found in Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos or Crowley's Aiwass transmissions, without being destroyed by the sheer force of the void. In Night Side of Eden, Grant mapped each tunnel to its corresponding Hebrew letter, tarot card trumps, and a specific guardian demon or Qliphothic force. The following is the sequential breakdown of the 22 Tunnels of Set, so follow along with me as we move from the top of the inverted tree down to the deepest roots of the void. And pro tip, it might not hurt to bring along a poncho. Also, I don't speak a lick of Hebrew, so it goes without saying that I may undoubtedly butcher some of these names. No offense to any Hebrews, Shebrews, sorcerers, or dark entities is intended. The journey begins at the cosmic threshold with Tunnel 11. That's right, starting at 11. Guarded by Amprodius. This is the inverted archetype of the Fool, representing the initial leap into the vacuum of absolute space and a shattering of the human ego. Immediately following is Tunnel 12, where the entity Batrachial commands a sorcerous distortion of time and space, firing like a lightning bolt of pure manipulation. As we drop deeper, we encounter Tunnel 13 and its guardian Gargophius. This path embodies the Dark Priestess, a gate of the dark feminine that leads into deep sea atavisms and the terrifying depths of the astral womb. This current leads into Tunnel 14, guarded by Dagdagiel, which rules over the forbidden, non-reproductive sexual sorceries and cosmic pollution of the inverted Empress. As the descent deepens, the atmosphere shifts towards dark authority and psychological fracturing. Tunnel 15 belongs to, oh boy, here we go. Hemethterith. No, that's not a lisp, that's how you say it. Hemethterith, a realm of Typhonian ordering principles used to violently manipulate astral currents. Next is Tunnel 16, where the entity Urians acts as a grim initiator, forcing the traveler through suffering, the mysteries of the phallus, that's what it said, and the literal putrefaction of flesh. Sounds a lot like my early 20s. Tunnel 17 is guarded by Zamradiel, a deeply unsettling zone that governs the astral double, the doppelganger, and splits the traveler's consciousness into warring cosmic factions. From there, Tunnel 18 and its guardian Charasith introduce a vampiric current, dealing in the extraction of vital energies and the navigation of phantom vehicles or hollow astral shells. Tunnel 19 is watched over by Qliphoth, who controls the rawest, most dangerous expressions of the Kundalini fire snake. Traveler is then plunged into Tunnel 20, where Yamatu holds court over a terrifying silent darkness, a domain of absolute withdrawal from human contact into cosmic loneliness. Probably been in that tunnel before, once or twice. Midway through the Tree of Death, the laws of nature completely dissolve. Tunnel 21 is guarded by Kurgasiax, who spins the wheel of chaotic predatory destinies and atavistic reincarnation. This leads to Tunnel 22 and the entity Lafkursiax, a zone where cosmic equilibrium is destroyed and severe spatial dislocation occurs. In Tunnel 23, Malkunofat rules over the mysteries of deep water drowning, the loss of individual identity, and wealth obtained through sacrifice. The macabre sense of foreboding deepens in Tunnel 24, where Niantiel commands the necromantic currents of spiritual decay and alchemical putrefaction. Tunnel 25 is guarded by Saxaxalim, Lake Amasalam, deals with the compounding of dangerous psychoactive elixirs and the violent transmutation of astral fluids. This brings the traveler face to face with Tunnel 26, the guardian Anonin, A''A''N''O''N''I''. Your guess is as good as mine. The direct embrace of the horned god, Setpan, which generates pure, unbridled material illusions. Tunnel 27 is guarded by Parfaxitas, a violent corridor that shatters structural realities through sudden psychic explosions and astral warfare. The final stretch of the night side brings the traveler to the edge of our solar matrix. Tunnel 28 is guarded by... Oh, God, here's another. Okay, hold on. Tunnel 28 is guarded by Qliphoth, pouring down stellar poisons and cosmic radiation from constellations far outside our known universe. Tunnel 29 is the domain of Qliphoth. God damn it. Qliphoth. Governing deep illusions, nightmares, lycanthropy, and the manipulation of witchcraft currents under a dark moon. And then comes Tunnel 30, where Raflifu commands the black sun of the underworld, a binding reverse illumination that completely burns away human morality. Near the very bottom, Tunnel 31 is watched over by Shaliku, the gate of fire and ash that resurrects ancient pre-human gods from their terrestrial tombs. And finally, at the absolute base of the inverted tree lies Tunnel 32, guarded by Thantifaxath. This is the lowest, densest path of the cosmos, a slow, claustrophobic crawl through a subterranean labyrinth of matter, ghouls, and absolute physical gravity. The paths aren't numbered 1 through 10 because numbers 1 through 10 don't represent paths at all. They represent the Sephiroth, the spheres or nodes of power on the tree, while the paths connecting them are numbered 11 through 32. Now here's how the numbering actually works on both sides of the tree and how the light side fits into it. On the standard traditional Kabalistic tree of life, the 10 Sephiroth, there's the 10 Sephiroth, numbered 1 through 10. These are the major spheres of divine energy, starting from 1, Kether, the crown, at the top, and descending to 10, Malkuth, the physical kingdom, our world, at the bottom. Then there's the 22 paths, numbered 11 through 32. These are the actual highways or channels that connect those 10 spheres to each other. They correspond directly to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the 22 major arcana cards of the tarot. When Grant inverted the tree to map the night side of Eden, he kept the exact same numbering system for the structural blueprint, but he flipped the nature of the spaces entirely. The 10 Sephiroth become the 10 Qliphoth. Instead of spheres of holy light, 1 through 10, they become the shells or adverse spheres of chaotic primordial energy. For example, the top sphere, Kether, 1, has a dark twin called Thaumiel, the dual warring forces. The bottom sphere, Malkuth, 10, our world, as I'm led to understand it, has a dark twin called Lilith, or the Queen of Night. 22 paths become the 22 tunnels of Set. The pathways connecting these chaotic spheres retain their original path numbers, 11 through 32, but they become the dark subterranean tunnels guarded by the entities we just discussed. In Typhonian occultism, the light side isn't a different set of numbers on the same map. It's the day side or the front face of the tree. Think of the tree of life like a coin. The front face, the day side, contains Sephiroth 1 through 10 and paths 11 through 32 in their organized, balanced light form. If you flip that exact same coin over to the back, the night side, the Sitra Achra, you'll find the exact same numbers, spheres 1 through 10 and tunnels 11 through 32. They're now inverted into their chaotic, alien, dark reflections. But since I'm a stickler for details, let's go ahead and also cover the 10 spheres or Sephiroth or Qliphoth proper, along with the mysterious 11th shell or phantom threshold, as well as each of the resident entities you'll find therein. Just as the day side of the tree has 10 holy spheres of divine order, the night side features 10 adverse anti-spheres. These aren't paths, but the cosmic destinations where reality is turned entirely inside out. So 1, we have Thaumiel. This is the inversion of Kether, the crown. At the absolute peak of the night side sits Thaumiel, meaning the twins of God. While the divine crown represents absolute unity, Thaumiel is a broken, two-headed entity of eternal division, rebellion, and duality. It's ruled by the twin forces of Satan and Moloch. There are corresponding, goetic demons, entities, etc. for each one of these. Then there's Gogil / Chagediel. I think that's how you say it. This is the inversion of Chakma, or wisdom. Below the crown sits Gogil, the Hinderers. This sphere represents the absolute corruption of wisdom and divine masculine energy, introducing chaotic, jagged interruptions into cosmic thought. It's ruled by Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, one of my favorites. Sateriel, the inversion of Bina, or understanding. Opposite Gogil is Sateriel, the Concealers. If Bina is the divine mother who births understanding, Sateriel is the dark, triangular veil of cosmic fog that hides the light and conceals primordial secrets. It's guarded by Lucifuge Rofocal. Then there's, oh boy, some of these are just fucking impossible. All right. Gagakshikla, or Gamchioth. This is the inversion of Chesed, or Mercy. Yeah, weren't showing any mercy when they came up with that name. Moving down into the emotional realm, we find Gamchikloth. I'm not even going to try the other one. The Smiters, or Devourers. It takes the divine trait of infinite mercy and twists it into an all-consuming tyrannical maw of unbridled greed and dominance. It's ruled by the archdemon Astaroth. This is the never mind, I was going to make a political joke, but it's hackneyed. Next, you have Golachab, the inversion of Geberah, or severity, judgment. Across the tree sits Golachab, the burners. Geberah is righteous discipline, but its night-side shadow is pure, unmitigated wrath, explosive violence, and uncontrolled burning lust. It's ruled by Asmodeus. If you've ever read the comic Promethea, they specifically have a segment where they inhabit. Well, they're doing a tour of the Sephiroth on the tree as specific realms that they're visiting, and they sort of end up in a flip side of this because justice, judgment, etc., very easily, it can be righteous, but it can also very easily become inverted to wrath. Next up is Thagiriran, the inversion of Tifereth, beauty or harmony. The very center of the tree lies Thagiriran, the disputers. Tifereth is the harmonious heart and the solar center, but Thagiriran is the black sun, a hollow, weeping facade of false vanity and spiritual ugliness. It's ruled by Belphegor. Next is Arab Zarak, the inversion of Netzach, or victory. This is occupied by the ravens of death, or corrosive ones. It corrupts the emotional victory and passions of Netzach into animalistic hedonism, dark obsessive lust, and a swarm of dispersing ravens that pick away at the soul. Delightful. It's ruled by Baal. Then there's Samael, the inversion of Had, or splendor. Opposite the ravens is Samael, the poison of God, or the deceivers. Where Had represents rational intellect and logic, Samael is a labyrinth of lies, false logic, and intellectual traps designed to ensnare human consciousness. It's ruled by Adremelech. Then there's Gamaliel, the inversion of Yesod, or foundation. This is near the bottom and inhabited by the obscene ones. Fucking shit, yeah, it is. Yesod is the astral foundation of dreams and subconscious cycles. But Gamaliel is the ultimate realm of nightmares, sorcery, and twilight perversions. Ooh. It's ruled by Lilith, of course, the queen of demons and metaphysical feminist icon. Then there's Lilith, Nehemoth, which you'd think Lilith would inhabit Lilith, but no, that would be too simple. This is the inversion of Malkuth, the kingdom. At the very base of the tree sits the physical husk of the universe, Nahimath, the Whisperers, often synonymous with the gutter world of Lilith, quote unquote. And this, hey, I got no problem with Lilith. I'm just repeating the news. This is what I read. This is what the research has shown. This is our material Earth, but viewed as completely fragmented, decaying, and enslaved by dense, blind materialism. So, yeah, it's a fucking Tuesday. What do you want? It's ruled by the demoness Naama. Naama, go to the next one. Ha ha ha. Now, if listeners are counting along, you'll notice an empty space on the map. Hanging between the upper triad of cosmic consciousness and the lower world of emotion sits a phantom sphere, Da'ath, the Hebrew word for knowledge. In traditional Kabbalah, Da'ath is not a true Sephiroth. It's an invisible, bridge-like non-sphere. It only manifests when a human mind bridges the gap between raw wisdom and structured understanding. But in Kenneth Grant's Typhonian cosmology, Da'ath is something far more sinister. It's the literal abyss, the cosmic trapdoor. Now, once again, I'm going to defer to the Alan Moore comic book Promethea. They go on a bit of a tour of Da'ath, and it doesn't seem all that... I mean, the way he depicts it doesn't seem all that bad. I don't know. I mean, it's weird. It's a weird place, it looks like, but I don't know. I mean, this may be one of those your mileage may vary kind of things. Looking at things in the occult, there's still a very lingering, haunting specter of the Victorian, prude, puritanical mind state that just looms so large over everything. I'm actually doing research on a future episode for the Black Lodge. Just the concept of the Black Lodge as appears throughout various occult writings, etc. And God damn. Without getting too much away, it's that Victorian puritanical mind state. Like, it still haunts and colors so many perceptions of occultism as we know it today. It's fucking ridiculous. Anyways, in traditional Kabbalah, Da'ath is not a true Sephiroth. In Kenneth Grant's Typhonian cosmology, Da'ath is the literal abyss, the cosmic trapdoor. When the universe fell into matter, Da'ath fractured. On the night side, this empty void becomes the ultimate gateway between the front and back of the tree. This is how one traverses from the front side to the other side. It's guarded by the archdemon Belial, whose name means the worthless one, or without a master. So, I don't know. Just, I'm all for not having a master. So, I don't know. This is one of the other presiding, like, religious ontologies that just fucking colors all the perceptions of this shit. Religious/Victorian sensibilities, if you will. The path through the Phantom Zone of Da'ath. One needs a Phantom Zone projector from Superman's Fortress of Solitude. Then a magician must front Choronzon, the demon of dispersion, or dweller in the abyss. Choronzon isn't a physical being with a face. He's a virus of the mind. He's the personification of ego madness, random chaotic thoughts, and meaningless noise. He'll also be getting his own episode, which is currently in the works. If a psychonaut tries to cross Da'ath without completely destroying their own ego, Choronzon moves in for the kill, shattering their consciousness into a billion incoherent fragments. The magician is left trapped forever in a phantom loop, unable to return to reality and unable to touch the divine, the cosmic border control of the occult world, and just as heavily armed. It's the point of no return. In Outside the Circles of Time, 1980, Kenneth Grant delivered what's arguably the most radical and conceptually challenging volume of his entire Typhonian Trilogies. If his previous books laid the foundation for an inverted magical universe, this text completely severed the occult from classical earthbound traditions. Grant positioned magic not as an archaic religious survival, but as a hyper-advanced extra-dimensional technology. I can dig it. Grant argued that the human brain and the ritual circle, when properly tuned through specialized psychosexual formulas and altered states, functioned exactly like a shortwave radio or cosmic telescope. The energies he sought to intercept were the transplutonic forces, currents of consciousness originating far beyond the known boundaries of our solar system, particularly from the dark spaces beyond Pluto and the star system of Sirius. Grant boldly claimed that what ancient humans called angels, gods, or demons were simply primitive cultural interpretations of highly advanced, non-human radio transmissions cutting through the fabric of space-time. Moving away from the popular 1970s and 80s pop culture imagery of gray aliens with large eyes and metallic flying saucers, Grant introduced a far more unsettling Lovecraftian concept simply known as them. Capital T, them. Them are vast, amorphous, the grammatical shit is going to get to me every time. I'll try to power through it. Them are vast, amorphous, and ancient hyper-intelligences existing outside of linear time. This is what I'm talking about. They don't travel through physical space using ships. Instead, they migrate through human consciousness. I would assume they replicate through human consciousness too, but that's going into my own weird shit. Grant posited that they, them, or whatever pronouns they prefer, I'm not going to argue, has been interacting with humanity for millennia, subtly steering our evolution, our art, and occult history by seeding specialized ideas, mathematical patterns, and subconscious impulses in the minds of sensitive artists, madmen, and occultists, which quite often you'll find a lot of overlap. As well, might as well go ahead and throw intelligence apparatus agents in there as well. To explain how these transmissions enter our material reality, Grant introduced the concept of the ninth arch. He described it as a metaphysical gateway, or a localized fracture in space-time through which the draconian current, or primordial cosmic energy, could pour into our universe. By passing through the ninth arch, the sorcerer's mind enters the mauve zone, a fluid twilight state of absolute non-duality where the laws of cause and effect and linear time completely break down, allowing direct face-to-face communion with them. The core of the book relies heavily on physical artifacts and written transcripts produced during intense ritual operations by Grant's wife and magical partner, Steffi, aka Soror Ilyarun. I think that's how you say it. While in deep, chemically and ceremonially induced trances. Goddamn. Took me a lot of tries to say that. You don't get it through the editing, but yikes. Steffi acted as a living antenna for these transplutonic signals. The resulting material was characterized by non-linear syntax. The channeled text completely abandoned standard English grammar. Yeah, no shit. Opting for fragmented, cyclical, and mathematical word clusters that read like broken computer code from the future. There's also impossible geometry. Steffi produced dozens of automatic drawings featuring hyperdimensional sigils, overlapping angles that defied three-dimensional perspective, and portraits of entities that appeared both biological and mechanical. Biomechanical. The language of the void is another reoccurring aspect of this work. The transcripts frequently reference bizarre cosmic locales, specialized interstellar traffic logs, and cryptic warnings regarding the leaking of the mauve zone into regular human dream states. The period spanning the late 1970s research and the 1980 publication of Outside the Circles of Time was marked by a profound sense of psychological and physical displacement for Grant and the inner core of the Typhonian OTO, because they were actively attempting to open the ninth arch. The environment around them mirrored the chaotic nature of the text. As the group focused their rituals on transplutonic zones, a highly specific and bizarre physical phenomenon began to plague their workspaces. Practitioners reported a persistent, localized acoustic phenomena described as etheric static, or a dry, metallic electronic hum that seemed to vibrate directly in the inner ear, independent of any actual machinery being present. Concurrently, standard consumer electronics of the era, such as reel-to-reel tape recorders used to log trance speeches, typewriters, and basic lighting fixtures, would spontaneously fail, short-circuit, or record bursts of rhythmic mechanical static that Grant claimed were the physical backscatter of the transplutonic transmissions trying to ground themselves in Earth's electrical grids. So these various energies, entities, intelligences, whatever you want to call them, they need certain mediums through which they can manifest in our world. Because the book explicitly deals with operating outside the circles of time, the subjective experience of time within the lodge became incredibly unstable. During group workings aimed at contacting them, participants frequently experienced collective missing time anomalies. In one notable instance, a ritual intended to last a mere 20 minutes concluded to reveal that nearly 5 hours had elapsed externally. Yet none of the participants felt the passage of time or exhibited the physical signs of exhaustion. Conversely, some members reported experiencing terrifying micro-flashbacks in their everyday lives, where they would suddenly perceive their modern surroundings as simultaneously existing millions of years in the past and or in a decaying, futuristic wasteland. I almost said cool, but when I gave it a second thought, it's probably fucking horrifying. This sounds also pretty close to CE5 operations. Another future episode in the works is going to cover CE5 and CE6, believe it or not. Sorry. It's silly to me. Some of it's kind of silly. But yeah, CE5 operations where they're trying to essentially conjure forth contact with alien intelligences, etc. Perhaps the most unnerving high strangeness encountered during this phase was the profound psychological toll the material took on those who proofread or handled the early drafts. The boundaries of the mundane would seem to unpeel, so to speak. Editors and close associates reported that after spending hours analyzing Steffi's automatic scripts and Grant's cosmic theories, they would step outside into London streets only to find the world looking entirely synthetic, flat, or holographic. The vividness of their nightly dreams skyrocketed, with multiple lodge members independently reporting identical, reoccurring nightmares of a vast obsidian city built on non-Euclidean angles under a sky with 2 dead moons, convincing Grant that Outside the Circles of Time wasn't just a book, but an active, contagious psychic virus that was successfully realigning the human mind to perceive a vast, terrifyingly real cosmic ecosystem. The third book of the second trilogy, Hecate's Fountain, 1992, 12 years after his predecessor. The gap is significant. During this period, Grant had withdrawn from public occult activity. If there is such a thing, that's kind of an oxymoron, but the Typhonian order continued, but Grant himself was rarely seen. He was, according to the accounts that have emerged, engaged in intensive private workings, attempts to break through to the deepest levels of the Mauve Zone. Hecate's Fountain is the strangest of Grant's books, and man, that's fucking saying something. It centers on the figure of Hecate, the Greek goddess of witchcraft, crossroads, and the dead. But if you actually look at the mythology of Hecate before she was turned into this by the Greco-Roman culture, she was actually viewed as more of a world mother, actually referred to as the world soul. And I think the Chaldean, however you say it, Chaldean mythology. Anyway, Grant's Hecate isn't the same classical deity, the Greco-Roman kind. She's something older, something that predates the Greek pantheon, and something that Grant connects to the Typhonian current itself. The book introduces Grant's most elaborate system of correspondences yet, a dense web of connections linking Hecate to the Qliphoth, as well as transplutonic forces, the Mauve Zone, and to what Grant calls the Draconian Tradition. This is the secret current that runs beneath all magical systems, the primal force that was worshipped as the serpent, the dragon, or the worm. Grant claims that he ate the worm. Grant claims in the book that he had succeeded in contacting Hecate directly, that she had appeared to him and Steffi in physical form, that she'd instructed them in techniques of reverse time magic, and that she'd shown them the fountain of the title, a source of immortalizing energy that exists in the deepest levels of the Mauve Zone. The book includes detailed descriptions of rituals designed to access this fountain. They involve complex sexual techniques, of course, The use of specific drugs and precise combinations, and the construction of what Grant calls time tunnels, which are spaces where the normal flow of causality is suspended and where the magician can operate outside the linear progression of past, present, future. I've kind of pointed out before in other episodes that the human brain tends to think in cause and effect. We think in narratives. We think in stories. And that's why, to me at least, stories are so important. I think this is why mythology is immortal. Mythology never lies. It tells you something, even if it's not the thing it's telling you, if that makes sense. Most disturbing are Grant's accounts of the Hecate working itself, a series of rituals performed between 1985 and 1990 that he claims opened a permanent gateway to the mob zone. According to Grant, these workings produced physical manifestations that were witnessed by multiple participants. The appearance of a quote-unquote black light that illuminated without revealing. The manifestation of entities that could be touched and smelled but not seen directly. And the temporary suspension of gravity in specific areas of the ritual space. One account provided by a participant who has remained anonymous describes a ritual in which Steffi Grant became possessed, quote-unquote possessed by Hecate. Not in the theatrical sense of speaking in a deep voice, but in the sense of becoming something else entirely. The witness claims that Steffi's body seemed to elongate, that her skin took on a texture like polished stone, and that she spoke words that caused physical effects in the room. Objects moving, temperatures changing, and the manifestation of scents that had no discernible source. The working culminated, according to Grant, in the opening of the fountain itself, a moment when the barrier between the mob zone and ordinary reality became permeable, when energies could be drawn through from the other side. Grant claimed that he and Steffi had both bathed in this fountain, quote-unquote bathed, that they'd been transformed by it, and that they were no longer human in the strictly conventional sense. Whether this represents genuine magical achievement or a shared delusion is, again, unknown to us. But what's documented is that after this period, Grant's publications became even more obscure and difficult to process, as if that were fucking possible, as if he were writing for an audience that didn't quite exist yet, or that existed in a different configuration of space-time entirely. Also featured in Hecate's Fountain are excerpts from the operational diaries of the New Isis Lodge, which operated between 1955 and 1962, which contained some of Kenneth Grant's most alarming accounts of rituals that veered completely out of human control. Among these, few matches the pure cosmic terror of an operation involving a specially prepared fluid-filled ritual pool or scrying vat designed to act as a localized gateway for praetor-human forces. During this specific working, a senior priestess was tasked with anchoring the intense incoming energies of the Typhonian current. As the ceremonial incantations reached their peak, the atmosphere in the lodge room grew thick, heavy, and visibly distorted. Instead of a mere subjective vision or a subtle psychic impression, the fluid within the ritual pool underwent a violent physical transmutation. A mass of solidifying, writhing tentacles. That's right. I'm sure you can already guess where this is going to go. Described as looking like a cross between deep-sea cephalopod limbs and hyperdimensional mists, suddenly manifested directly out of the water. Before the lodge members could safely banish the intrusion, the physical entity lashed outward, ensnaring and violently attacking the priestess. The sudden assault shattered the ritual's containment, leaving the lodge to scramble to sever the link to the outer spaces before the entity could drag its target completely through the threshold. Grant later cataloged this terrifying event as a classical example of a spatial anomaly, or a mob zone intrusion, where the thin veil separating human consciousness from the horrific reality of the old ones temporarily dissolved. It's intimated that but essentially some dark anime type shit took place. Use your imagination, or not, whatever. Anyways, the third trilogy began with Outer Gateways, 1994, If the second trilogy had explored the night side of the Kabbalistic system, the third trilogy went beyond Kabbalah entirely. Grant was now drawing on sources that had nothing to do with the Western esoteric tradition. The Necronomicon, specifically the infamous Simon edition, which Grant treated as a genuine text, or at least a genuine transmission. It's all but proven at this point, I believe, that Peter Levenda, who's a brilliant researcher, he's very coy and private about his occult practitioner life, which I totally understand. If he's in fact still a practitioner, at least he was back in the day. But he's the one who wrote the Necronomicon, the Simon the Simon edition. He is Simon. Anywho, there's also the Book of Zion, Blavatsky's claimed ancient manuscript, as well as the cipher manuscripts of the Golden Dawn, which Grant reinterpreted radically, to say the least. The cipher manuscripts that helped found the Golden Dawn are still very disputed. I don't believe a lot of people have... I have to double check that. I don't want to say anything that I can't totally be sure on or find a source for. Anywho, the book includes detailed instructions for Necronomicon magic. Outer Gateways is about contact with what Grant calls the Old Ones, a term he borrows from Lovecraft but redefines. For Grant, the Old Ones aren't fictional creations but accurate descriptions of transplutonic or Trans-Yuggothian forces. Lovecraft, Grant argues, was an unconscious medium who received transmissions from the Mauve Zone and encoded them in his fiction. The Cthulhu cult of the stories was based on real groups that Grant claimed to have contacted and worked with. The idea of encoded information is a big problem. It's open to interpretation, but I don't know. But the negative side of this is shit like QAnon. Stuff like that. Anyway. The book includes detailed instructions for Necronomicon magic, rituals designed to contact the entities Lovecraft described: Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, Bleep-Zoop-Zorp, Katingalabingalading, and all the rest. Grant treats these entities as masks or refractions of the same forces he'd been working with all along: the Typhonian current, the Draconian tradition, and the powers of the Mauve Zone. Now, you've probably heard me use this term Mauve Zone about a dozen times by now. Well, I've explained it before in a previous episode. I'll go ahead and re-explain for anyone new to these Trans-Yuggothian shenanigans. To understand the Mauve Zone, you have to look beyond our standard maps of heaven, hell, or outer space. In Kenneth Grant's cosmic architecture, the Mauve Zone isn't a physical destination, but a fluid, hyperdimensional threshold, a mystical twilight zone that hovers directly between the universe we know and the vast absolute vacuum of the outer void. It's the ultimate borderland of consciousness, taking its name from that specific liminal shade of purple that represents the perfect bleeding edge of where the day completely dissolves into night. When a psychonaut enters this territory, the fundamental laws of consensus reality are instantly stripped away. Inside the Mauve Zone, linear time ceases to function. Three-dimensional Euclidean geometry buckles, and the human ego is entirely turned inside out. It functions as a sort of metaphysical staging ground or an extra-dimensional transit station. Because it exists in a state of absolute non-duality, where opposites like past and future or internal psychology and external reality completely merge, it's the only space where a human mind can safely encounter hyper-advanced non-human intelligences without being immediately driven insane by the sheer scale of the cosmos. To perhaps better visualize it, think of the Mauve Zone as a cosmic mirror or an open doorway. It's the exact point where human dreams, surrealist art, and deep occult ritual collide with the incoming transmissions of alien consciousness whispering from the outside the circles of time. So to cross into the Mauve Zone is to step into a bridge where the material world is revealed to be a mere shadow, allowing the traveler to stand face to face with the ancient, unnameable forces that inhabit the deep ecosystems of the universe. This was Grant at his most, quote-unquote, controversial. Serious occultists accused him of confusing fiction with reality, of degrading the magical tradition by treating horror stories as scriptures. Grant's response was that The distinction between fiction and reality was itself a product of limited consciousness. You just don't get it, man. And in the mob zone, all stories were true, all myths were memories, and that all fiction was history viewed from the wrong angle. The book also includes Grant's most explicit discussions of what he calls the secret chiefs, the astral masters who guide the evolution of human consciousness. Grant claimed to be in regular communication with these beings, receiving instructions from them, and was acting as their terrestrial representative. He described them as non-human, but not in the sense of extraterrestrials. Instead, they were transhuman, beings who'd evolved beyond the need for physical bodies, who now existed as pure consciousness in the mob zone. Not to necessarily say that they were all human at one point, but I think you kind of get the point. The implications were somewhat disturbing. If Grant was correct, that human history wasn't random but directed, guided by forces that had their own agenda, their own timelines, and their own criteria for what constituted success or failure. And magic was the technology for plugging into this guidance system, for receiving the transmissions, and perhaps most importantly, for participating in the great work that is human evolution. Beyond the Mob Zone, 1999, is arguably Grant's masterpiece and his most inaccessible work. And once again, man, that is fucking saying something. It attempts to describe what lies beyond the systems he'd already mapped, beyond the tree of life and death, and beyond even the Mob Zone itself. Grant introduces the concept of the Mob Zone as a threshold, a liminal space between the human and the transhuman, between the terrestrial and the trans-plutonic, or Trans-Yuggothian, if you're freaky. But beyond the Mob Zone, he suggests there are other zones, colors that don't exist in the human visual spectrum, geometries that don't conform to human mathematics, and consciousness that doesn't operate on human timescales. The book is structured as a series of quote-unquote transmissions, automatic writings produced by Grant and Steffi during extended trance sessions. They're represented without commentary, without interpretation, as raw data, quote-unquote, from the beyond. The reader is expected to make their own sense of them, or to recognize that sense-making in itself is a limitation that must be transcended. Once again, you just don't get it, man. Don't understand. Just out there shit, man. Presented as incomprehensibly brilliant. That's why you don't get it. No, I don't know. Once again, it's all an interpretation. Where do ideas come from? One could argue a unicorn is real because I'm talking about it. You know what it is. You heard of it. When I say unicorn, an image pops into your head. So in that sense, it's real. But in the other sense, we all know that unicorns, at least today, maybe they were another kind of real at some point in our far, far past history. Anywho, some of the material is genuinely beautiful. Poetic evocations of spaces beyond space, times beyond time, or beings that exist as patterns of relationships rather than as objects. Some of it is downright weird and terrifying. Descriptions of the hunger, not me, that waits at the center of the universe, of the void that is not empty but full of teeth, or the return that is not death but worse than death. And some of it is simply incomprehensible. Once again, it's just pages of symbols, numbers, diagrams that don't correspond to any known system, and languages that don't translate into any human tongue. Grant claimed that this material wasn't meant for everyone. Yeah, no shit. That it was specifically encoded for, quote, those who have eyes to see, unquote. Man, that phrase is going to cause more trouble throughout, whatever. Anyways, okay. It's for initiates who'd already done the preliminary work of traversing the tunnels of Set, of contacting the forces of the night side, and of establishing themselves in the Mob Zone. For the unprepared, he warned, the book could be dangerous, not physically, but psychologically, spiritually, and existentially. Reading it without the proper foundations was like plugging in a 110-volt appliance into a 220-volt outlet. Something's going to burn out. The book also contains Grant's most explicit discussion of what he calls the end, quote-unquote, the end. Not the apocalypse of any religious tradition, but the end of the human experiment. The point at which consciousness would either evolve beyond the need for physical form or collapse back into the chaos from which it emerged. Grant believed that this point was approaching, that the transmissions, quote-unquote transmissions, were becoming more frequent and more urgent because the window for human evolution was closing. This kind of plays into stuff like contacting your holy guardian angel, or certain aspects of Vajrayana Tantra, Vajrayana Buddhism, etc., and time travel, believe it or not. He wrote, quote, "The old ones are returning, not as conquerors, but as gardeners, to reap what has been sown. The question is not whether we will be ready, but whether we will be recognizable to them or to ourselves," unquote. Food for thought. Needs a little seasoning. The Ninth Arch, 2002, was Kenneth Grant's final book. He lived until 2011, but he published nothing afterwards. Very much unlike Tupac in that way. The book is, in many ways, a summation, a return to the themes of the first trilogy, but viewed from the perspective of someone who's traveled much farther. The Ninth Arch of the title refers to a specific gateway of the Qliphothic system, the final portal that leads from the night side into the Mav Zone and beyond. Grant claimed that he'd successfully traversed this arch and that he'd crossed the abyss, quote-unquote, crossed the abyss, not in the conventional Kabalistic sense, but in a more radical way. Everything he does is far more radical than that he had established a permanent connection to the Trans-Yuggothian forces. The book includes what Grant claimed was his most important transmission, the Book of the Spider, forward by Peter Parker, a text received from an entity that identified itself as the Weaver, a consciousness that claimed to have created the web of space-time itself. The text is presented in full without commentary. It reads like a combination of advanced physics, mystical poetry, and schizophrenic ramblings, with numerous references to the mesh, the tangle, the knot that is not tied but is, the knot, or the space between the spaces where the current flows, quote-unquote, on all that. In the Ninth Arch, Kenneth Grant shifted his focus from abstract cosmic geometry to address the real-world casualties of the Typhonian current, turning his final volume into a grim catalog of cautionary tales. Grant firmly believed that the other side of the Tree of Life operated like a highly volatile, uninsulated power grid. To him, those who approached these gateways with an inflated ego, a desire for personal wealth, or a total lack of psychological grounding were destined to be shattered by the very currents they sought to channel. He used these accounts to settle scores with contemporary occultists, arguing that treating hyperdimensional magic like a lawless playground would inevitably lead to absolute destruction. The first major disaster he details is the London working of 1989, which Grant cited as a textbook case of an occultist mistaking their own psychological projections for true cosmic mastery. A prominent Western magician attempted to independently pierce the Ninth Arch, entirely bypassing the traditional anchoring and grounding protocols of the Typhonian OTO. The magician's intent was to force a permanent physical manifestation of an extra-dimensional entity directly into a localized urban space. Instead, because they failed to properly polarize the incoming cosmic energies, their consciousness was completely overrun by Choronzon, the demon of dispersion. Grant describes the aftermath as a total and catastrophic fracturing of the practitioner's rational mind, leaving them in a permanent state of psychological displacement where they could no longer distinguish between the physical streets of London and the shifting, non-Euclidean labyrinths of the tunnels of Set. Moving across the Atlantic, Grant details an even grimmer warning in what he termed the New York incident of 1994. This tragedy occurred when a small independent group attempted to combine Michael Bertot's Voodoo Gnostic currents with intense, volatile sexual sorcery. Their goal was to open a localized trapdoor within the phantom Sephirah of Da'ath to physically ground a transplutonic intelligence into our material reality. Every time these groups are trying to bring a eldritch abomination into reality permanently, this is when people fuck up. This is what almost all the stories are about. Grant explains that the participants fatally underestimated the raw kinetic power of the Sitra. At the absolute peak of the invocation, the primary ritual medium suffered a catastrophic etheric rupture. The sheer velocity of the incoming extra-dimensional energy physically overwhelmed the participant's nervous system, resulting in immediate and fatal heart failure right on the ritual floor. Grant used this case to remind his readers that the entities existing beyond the veil operate with absolute lethal indifference to human fragility. The final case study in collective destruction is the Sydney manifestation of 1997, where a fractured occult cell attempted to map the deepest, densest roots of the inverted tree by targeting Tunnel 32 and its guardian, Thantefaksath. The group utilized a synchronized mirror working, attempting to create a collective astral lens that would allow multiple witnesses to perceive the exact same extra-dimensional entity at the exact same time. The operation succeeded, but with terrifying consequences, as per usual, as the mirror didn't just reflect an entity, but instead completely unpeeled the fabric of consensus reality in the immediate environment. Multiple eyewitnesses, including non-participant observers nearby, were struck by a sudden wave of severe spatial dislocation, experiencing a synchronized waking nightmare of a black landscape beneath a dying sun. The psychic shock was so intense that it caused multiple simultaneous psychotic breaks among the participants, requiring long-term institutionalization. For Grant, it was ultimate proof that while the gate to the outside can be forced open, surviving it requires a level of wisdom that these practitioners simply did not possess. These accounts are presented as cautionary tales. Seems they're also presented as a bit of like, I told you so's, but whatever. Examples of what happens when the Typhonian current is contacted without proper preparation, without the guidance of the secret chiefs, or without the balance that only years of disciplined practice can provide. But there's also a sense of triumph in the book, of someone who survived what others haven't, who've gone further and returned to tell the tale. The final section of the Ninth Arch is Grant's most explicit statement of his philosophy. He rejects the quote-unquote spiritual interpretation of magic that had become so popular in the New Age movement. Magic isn't about self-improvement, nor is it about healing, and most definitely not about love and light. It's about knowledge, gnosis, and knowledge is dangerous. It's about contact with forces that don't care about human welfare. It's about becoming something other than human, even if that means sacrificing everything that makes life worth living in conventional terms. He writes, quote, "The Typhonian current is not a path for the comfortable. It is not a hobby for the spiritually curious. It is a transmission from the outside, and those who tune to its frequency will be changed by it, transformed, transmuted, translated into other dimensions of being. This is not a promise, it is a warning." Unquote. The Typhonian Trilogies represent only the public face of Kenneth Grant's output. Behind and alongside these dense magical treaties lies a shadow library. Memoirs that read like grimoires, essays that function as coded transmissions, and a series of novels that Grant insisted weren't fiction at all, but quote-unquote documentaries of the Mauve Zone, unquote. To understand the full scope of Grant's project, one must venture beyond the trilogies into these lesser-known works, where the boundaries between instructions and experience dissolve entirely. Before the trilogies began with the Magical Revival in 1972, Grant published two crucial works that established his voice and his relationship to Crowley's legacy. The first, The Tree of Life, 1969, was essentially a revised and expanded version of his private magical diary from the 1950s. Unlike the later trilogies, which assumed significant occult knowledge, The Tree of Life functions as a primer, Grant teaching the fundamentals of Crowley's system while quietly inserting his own innovations, quote-unquote innovations. The book is notable for its inclusion of what Grant calls the Typhonian Gnosis, material he claimed to have received directly from the secret chiefs during his early workings with Steffi. These sections read differently from the rest of the text, more urgent, less structured, often breaking into verse or automatic writing. Grant would later claim that these passages were dictated by an entity called, quote, the Keeper of the Threshold, unquote, a guardian of the Mauve Zone who had authorized Grant to begin public transmission of the current. Sounds like Karanzan to me. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of talk and hoo-ha and make what you will of this and that of Karanzan being the ultimate guardian of the threshold, but I mean, I don't know, there's a lot of thresholds, so there must be a lot of guardians. To clear up a quick bibliographic knot, before we dive into the methodology. At the Feet of the Guru was a collection of Grant's essays on Eastern mysticism and Advaita Vedanta yoga, published much later. To understand Advaita Vedanta in the context of the deeper esoteric traditions that we've been exploring this episode, you first have to look past the complex philosophy and focus on a single radical concept: absolute non-duality. Originating in India and formalized by the ancient sage Adi Shankara, the word Advaita literally translates to not two. Number two, it's the spiritual realization that the perceived division between the individual human consciousness and the vast ultimate fabric of the universe is a complete illusion. There is no boundary, there is no separation. According to this philosophy, the material world we interact with every day is governed by Maya, a cosmic illusion or a trick of perception that makes the universe appear fragmented into separate objects, people, and distances. There's some who've argued that the introduction of this separation from self-other is what constitutes the biblical fall that befell Adam and Eve, etc., etc. Advaita Vedanta teaches that underneath this superficial world of multiplicity lies a singular, unproduced reality called Brahman. The ultimate goal of the seeker is to realize that their own innermost soul or core awareness, known as the Atman, isn't merely connected to this supreme cosmic reality, it is that reality. So when you bridge this back to Typhonian and left-hand path traditions that Kenneth Grant studied, you can see why he was so deeply fascinated by it. While mainstream religions focus on a distant external god that humans must worship from afar, Advaita Vedanta presents a framework where the individual is already the divine whole. They've just forgotten how to see it. It's a philosophy that completely dissolves the boundary lines between the self and the cosmos, serving as a perfect metaphysical foundation for anyone attempting to map the boundless, unified territory of the Mauve Zone. His definitive, intimate memoir, tracking those final years spent with Crowley at the Netherwood residence in Hastings, is Remembering Aleister Crowley. When analyzing the sexual operations from this period through the rigorous, quote-unquote, scientific lens that Grant and Crowley favored, it becomes clear that they viewed the human body not as an instrument of pleasure, but as a biological particle accelerator, a highly calibrated radio transmitter designed to pierce the fabric of space and time. Once again, there's a super collider joke in there somewhere, but this is largely a scholarly podcast. We'll move past such immaturities. Within the methodology of the Ordo Templi Orientis, specifically the Sovereign Sanctuary of the 9th degree and the Inverted 11th degree, the mechanics of sex magic are treated as precise alchemical laboratory work. The foundational methodology relies on the polarization of the male and female bioelectrical currents. In these operations, the physical friction and eventual exhaustion of the sexual act are deliberately harnessed to generate a state of hyper-focused trance, effectively shutting down the rational mind and allowing the deep subconscious to surface. Grant elaborated that Crowley's hidden genius lay in recognizing that the climax of the rite acts as a localized tearing mechanism in the material grid, creating a brief vacuum or portal through which extra-dimensional forces can be drawn down into our reality. The highly technical scientific core of these rituals involves the manipulation and consumption of what the Typhonian tradition calls the kalas, or the specialized psychosexual secretions generated during the operation. From an alchemical standpoint, the male secretion is treated as the solar phallic current, while the female secretion acts as the lunar receptive magnet. When these fluids are fused under conditions of absolute magical intent, they undergo a transformation into an elixir. This elixir is treated as a highly concentrated physical battery of magical energy. The practitioners don't just view this as symbolic, they analyze the secretions as living biological matrices capable of absorbing the mental impressions or the specific vibration of an invading extra-dimensional intelligence, effectively anchoring a permanent doorway to the outside world right within the physical laboratory of the ritual space. So, as is my understanding, which isn't all that great, the intent behind the production of these fluids is greatly important, as well as the time in which they are produced, i.e. the astrological overhang, when they're made, how they're made. These secretions, can't spell secretion without secret, these secretions are meant to act as a sort of physical medium through which manifestation of outer dimensional intelligences can take place. I think that's the overall gist. I'm probably way off base with that, but once again, I'm not a practicing occultist. I'm just trying to interpret this the best I can. It's just a regular dude. In the Typhonian tradition, the term kalas is borrowed from Hindu Tantra, specifically the Sri Chakra and the Kaula lineages, where the word literally means digits or rays of the moon. Kenneth Grant adapted the Eastern concept into Western sex magic, mapping the kalas as tangible psychosexual and chemical secretions generated by human biology during ritual invocation. Rather than viewing the mechanics of sex magic as purely psychological or emotional act, Grant and his new Isis Lodge analyzed these fluids as volatile living matrices. They believe that as a ritual reaches its climax, the human endocrine system acts as a biochemical factory, shifting through highly specific hormonal and energetic phases. Each phase emits a distinct kala, or psychosexual frequency, which can be harvested, blended into a magical elixir, and used to anchor a specific extra-dimensional intelligence into physical reality. So yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. That's the $10 way of saying what I just said a minute ago. In traditional Tantra and Grant's Typhonian cosmology, there are 16 primary kalas, matching the 16 days of the waxing and waning lunar cycles. Each kala corresponds to a specific phase of the woman's biological and occult cycle, generating a different energetic frequency when fused with the solar phallic current of the male. The first to fifth kalas are the elemental gates. These foundational phases correspond directly to the gross material elements, by which I mean earth, water, fire, air, and void or aether, akasha, etc. Very many different ways to name it, but the fifth element. When these initial kalas are generated, the resulting elixir behaves like a heavy physical anchor, used primarily for dense manifestations, materialized poltergeist anomalies, or grounding entities into physical temple spaces. The 6th to 15th kalas, the planetary and astral zones, these intermediate phases correspond to the traditional planetary spheres and the specialized goddesses of the Hindu lunar cycle known as the Nityas. As the ritual operations progress through the days of the moon, the phases, the secretions become less physically dense and highly charged with psychic radiation, quote-unquote, psychic radiation. Practitioners use these specific kalas to activate advanced states of astral projection, dream control, and the opening of localized spatial anomalies. And the 16th kala, the Shodashi, the full moon, in Tantra, it's known as the Shodashi. This represents the absolute peak of the visible lunar cycle. It's the phase of the fully illuminated, complete manifestation. When the 16th kala is secreted and combined with the phallic current, the elixir acts as a total mirror, capable of reflecting the pure, unadulterated consciousness of the higher self, or giving temporary objective shape to an arriving praetor-human intelligence. It's biochemical manifestation material for eldritch abominations, quote-unquote. While the first 16 kalas govern everything that can manifest within the boundaries of space, time, and matter, Grant's entire Trans-Yuggothian architecture relies on a hidden, paradoxical anomaly, the 17th kala, traditionally called the Amakala or the Amrita in Buddhism. Tantric Buddhism, etc. The 17th kala isn't part of the normal visible moon. It represents the dark phase of the moon, the invisible non-day, and the ultimate gateway to the Sitra Achra. It's a secretion that can only be produced when the 16 regular phases are entirely transcended or driven into absolute exhaustion during deep, hyper-focused psychosexual trance states. Instead of acting as a physical building block or an astral mirror, the Amakala functions as a chemical acid that dissolves consensus reality. It's the fluid expression of the phantom Sephirah of Da'ath on the ninth arch. When the 17th Kala is successfully generated in the ritual space, it acts as a literal solvent to the material matrix, quote unquote. It punctures a hole in three-dimensional Euclidean geometry, allowing the immediate environment of the temple to bleed out into the mob zone. This is the ultimate holy grail of Typhonian sorcery. The 17th Kala is the exact biochemical technology required to bridge the gap between human neurology and the completely alien Trans-Yuggothian intelligences waiting outside the circles of time. Most disturbing is Grant's description of Crowley's final days. Oh my god. I can only imagine. He writes of the old magician's death not as a medical failure, but as a translation, quote-unquote translation. Crowley's consciousness being withdrawn into the mob zone by the secret chiefs, leaving behind only a husk that ceased to function. Grant claimed to have witnessed Crowley's astral body departing during the final hours, accompanied by a sound like the tearing of silk, quote-unquote, and the smell of, quote, violets and burning copper, unquote. In 1989, Grant and Steffi published Hidden Lore, The Carven Stone, a unique hybrid of art book and grimoire. Steffi contributed a series of drawings and paintings, abstract, organic, vaguely biological forms that she claimed were attempts to depict entities encountered in the mob zone. Kenneth provided text, prose poems, ritual instructions, and what he called the verbal keys, or phrases in unknown languages that he claimed unlocked specific gates in the tunnels of Set. The barbarous names, if you will. The book is deliberately obscure, much like almost all of his work. The images resist interpretation. They seem to move when viewed peripherally, or shift when stared at directly. The text includes references to the carven stone itself, an object Grant claimed to actually possess, a meteoric rock covered in pre-human inscriptions that served as a physical anchor for Trans-Yuggothian forces. Whether this object actually existed, or was a metaphor for Steffi's artistic transmissions is unclear, but I'm going to lean towards the latter. Grant treated it as real, describing its weight, its temperature, it's always cold, even in the summer, and the quote-unquote humming sound it produced during rituals. Grant also wrote numerous introductions and essays for other occultist works, often using these platforms to advance Typhonian concepts. His introduction to Austin Osman Spare's The Book of Pleasure, reissued in 1975, is a crucial one. Grant connecting Spare's atavistic resurgence to the Typhonian current, arguing that Spare had unconsciously tapped into the same forces that he himself was accessing deliberately. His essays on the Necronomicon, published in a limited edition in 1987, treats Lovecraft's fiction as genuine magical transmissions, providing a system for using the Cthulhu mythos as an operational framework for contacting the old ones. I do believe this is the copy that I used to own, but it's the paperback edition that almost everybody had. That Simon Necronomicon. Let's see. Grant's published 4 novels during his lifetime, each representing a different aspect of the Typhonian system, rendered as a narrative. He insisted that these were not entertainment, but teaching stories. Fictionalized accounts of actual workings, coded instructions for techniques too dangerous to present openly, and warnings about the consequences of magical malpractice. Doctor, you give me the news. Grant's first novel, Against the Light, 1997, is also his most accessible, we'll say. A relatively straightforward horror narrative that nevertheless encodes magical theory. Plot follows a young magician named Simon, who discovers a manuscript by an obscure Victorian occultist. The manuscript describes a technique for, quote, reversing the light, unquote, a method of perceiving the night side of any object or being by viewing it through a specific crystal under the influence of a particular drug combination. Simon's experiments succeed a little too well. He begins seeing the shadow of everything, the hungry, living aspect of reality that exists beyond or behind the veneer of ordinary appearances. His girlfriend becomes possessed by an entity that claims to be her own reversed self, her night-side counterpart. The novel culminates in a ritual performance in a derelict London church where Simon attempts to banish the entity using techniques derived from the manuscript. The banishing fails. The entity consumes Simon, wearing his body like a suit. And the novel ends with this creature walking into the London night, indistinguishable from human except for its eyes, which, when caught in light, showed no reflection at all. I could be wrong. This sounds like it might have been an immense influence upon certain plot elements of Twin Peaks. That's just my own interpretation. The occult concepts embedded in Against the Light include Grant's theory of reversion, quote-unquote reversion, the idea that every created thing has a night-side counterpart, a shadow self that exists in the mauve zone and can be contacted, negotiated with, or consumed by. So, buyer beware. The crystal technique described in the novel is real, according to Grant. He claimed to have used it himself and warned that prolonged use can cause reversion of the self, where the magician's night-side aspect becomes dominant and the day-side personality is destroyed. The White Serpent, 1986, is Grant's exploration of the Draconian tradition, the worship of the serpent as the original source of wisdom and power. The narrative follows an archaeologist who discovers a pre-Sumerian temple in the Iraqi desert, dedicated to a serpent goddess named Tiamat's daughter. Not the Babylonian chaos monster, but something older and more alien. The temple contains a series of chambers, each representing a different level of initiation into the Draconian current. As the protagonist descends, he encounters entities that Grant describes with clinical precision, the coil-born, serpentine beings that exist in the spaces between dimensions, the egg keepers, guardians of a gestating consciousness that will eventually replace humanity. And it sounds like a Hellboy comic, or, well, extended Hellboy universe. And the White Serpent itself, a vast albino worm that serves as the physical anchor for the draconian forces on Earth. The novel's climax involves a sexual ritual between the protagonist and a female member of a surviving draconian cult. Grant describes this in great detail, not for titillation, but as instruction. The specific positions, the breathing techniques, the visualizations required to open the serpent's eye, a gateway into the mauve zone, are all presented as narrative detail. But Grant confirmed in interviews that these were operational techniques used by the Typhonian Order. So let's take a deeper look at these particular sexual rituals right now. The ritual itself occupies nearly 40 pages of Grant's narrative, presented with the clinical precision of a technical manual. The partners assume a position Grant calls the coiled serpent, a modification of the tantric yab-yum, look it up, in which the female partner sits astride the male, but with both bodies twisted in a spiral configuration. The man's right leg extended, the woman's left, creating what Grant describes as a living caduceus, the serpents entwined about the central staff. The breathing is synchronized to what Grant terms the draconian rhythm. 7 sharp inhalations through the nose, followed by a single prolonged exhalation through the mouth, performed simultaneously by both partners. This pattern is maintained for what the narrative specifies as 9 times 9 minutes. Quote-unquote, 9 times 9 minutes. 81 minutes of continuous union without release. Sorry. Oh, you'd have to be a tantric Superman. Anyways, during this period, both partners visualize what Grant calls the red serpent, a specific energy pathway that runs from the base of the spine, the kundalini, coils 3 times at the solar plexus, and terminates at the ajna center between the eyebrows, aka the third eye. The male partner employs a technique that Grant names the thrust of Set. Not a conventional sexual movement, but a series of 9 subtle muscular contractions. He's probably talking about Kegling, I assume, man Kegels, with synchronized breathing, designed to stimulate the female partner's corresponding energy signatures without conventional friction. The female partner performs the Milk of Hecate, a voluntary muscular control technique that Grant describes in explicit anatomical detail, creating a pulsing pressure along the red serpent pathway. At the 81st minute, the partners shift to what Grant calls the opening of the eye, a final position in which the woman arches backward until her head touches the ground behind the male partner's knees, creating the bow of the huntress. In this configuration, both partners direct their visualization to a point 12 inches above the crown of the head, where Grant locates the serpent's eye gateway to the mob zone. The male partner achieves what Grant terms the black diamond, a controlled orgasmic release that is redirected upward through the red serpent pathway rather than outward. The female partner simultaneously experiences the star ruby, a corresponding energetic event that Grant describes as the menstrual current reversed, flowing upward to meet the descending rod. Okay. The narrative specifies that at the moment of simultaneous peak, the partners must vocalize a specific, quote, word of opening, unquote, a vibratory pattern that Grant renders as a phonetic formula involving guttural stops and prolonged vowel sounds that the text claims, quote, shakes the etheric substrate, unquote. Grant describes the physical effects in detail. The temperature in the ritual space drops drastically. A violet luminescence appears at the point above the crown where the eye is visualized. Both partners experience, quote, the convulsion of the dragon, unquote, which are involuntary muscular spasms that move in waves from the base of the spine to the crown. And finally, the opening itself, which Grant describes as a sensation of, quote, the skull becoming porous, the brain exposed to a wind that blows from outside of the universe, unquote. The narrative makes clear that these aren't metaphorical descriptions. Grant specifies that the partners must maintain physical union throughout the entire opening process, that the male partner must remain inside the female partner during the convulsions, and that separation before the closing of the eye, a reversal of the breathing patterns performed 9 minutes after the opening, can result in, quote, the scattering, unquote, a condition where the energetic channels remain permanently open, leading to what Grant calls the wandering in the mauve zone without compass, quote unquote. The ritual concludes with what Grant terms the seal of the serpent. The partners returning to the coiled serpent position, now motionless, breathing in unison, visualizing the eye closing like a camera iris contracting, quote unquote, until the violet luminescence fades and ordinary consciousness returns. The narrative specifies that successful performance of the ritual leaves physical traces, a temporary mark of the serpent, a reddened pattern on the skin resembling scales that appears on the lower back of the female partner and the abdomen of the male, fading over 9 days. Sacred rug burn. The protagonist succeeds in opening the eye, but is consumed by what comes through, not destroyed, but quote-unquote translated into a serpent form and drawn into the mauve zone. The novel ends with his journal being found by another archaeologist who begins reading and, by the final page, starts experiencing the same dreams that drove the first protagonist to the temple. Then there's The Black Madonna, 1991. Grant's final novel is also his most overtly horrific, a narrative of possession, transformation, and the black flame of the Typhonian current. The plot concerns a young woman who becomes the vessel for an entity called the Black Madonna, not the Christian icon, but a pre-Christian goddess of death and rebirth, associated with the scorpion, the bat, and the black widow spider. The possession isn't violent, but seductive. Ooh. The entity offers the protagonist power, knowledge, and transformation. The novel follows her initiation into what Grant calls the cult of the Black Flame, a worldwide, that definitely is a Hellboy comic, a worldwide network of individuals who've been touched by the Typhonian current and serve as its terrestrial agents. Grant uses the novel to describe the Black Flame itself, a concept he only hints at in the non-fiction trilogies. The flame is the Typhonian current made visible, a black light that illuminates the mauve zone and reveals the true structure of reality. Those who've seen the flame are changed permanently. They can perceive the threads, quote-unquote threads, that connect all things, the quote-unquote webs that the old ones are weaving, and the approaching end that Grant believed was imminent. The novel includes detailed descriptions of rituals performed by the cult, the Mass of the Scorpion, where initiates are stung and brought to the edge of death to experience the black light, The Wedding of the Spider, quote unquote, where a female initiate is symbolically married to an entity from the tunnels of Set, and The Final Door, quote unquote, a working that opens a permanent gateway between the human world and the Mauve Zone. The protagonist completes all of these initiations and becomes fully possessed by the Black Madonna. The novel ends with her sitting in a London park appearing as an ordinary woman, but with the ability to see, quote, the hunger in everyone, the void behind their eyes, the threads that connect them to the flame, unquote. She's no longer human, Grant suggests, but somehow something new, a bridge between the human and the transhuman, the terrestrial and the Trans-Yuggothian. Grant was explicit about why he wrote fiction. Quote, the conscious mind resists direct instruction. It builds walls, filters, defenses. But the mind, relaxed by narrative, absorbed in story and character and the illusion of entertainment, remains porous. The transmissions enter through the back door, the side window, the cracks in the foundation, unquote. I couldn't agree more with this. Once again, stories, man, stories. They're immortal. They always will be. As long as there's someone to tell the story is going to be around. He claimed that readers of his novels who were quote-unquote ready, who'd done the preliminary work, who had the proper genetic or karmic predisposition, that sounds a little dangerous, would recognize the techniques embedded in the narratives and be able to decode and perform them. But worry not, uninitiated. For those who weren't ready would simply enjoy the horror stories, never realizing they'd been exposed to genuine magical instructions. There are reports, difficult to verify but persistent in occult circles apparently, of readers experiencing phenomena after engaging with Grant's fiction. The crystal of reversion technique from Against the Light allegedly produced genuine perceptual shifts in several readers who attempted it. The black flame visualizations from Black Madonna has been blamed by Grant's critics, though celebrated by his followers for a series of possessions reported in London occult circles in the 1990s. Grant neither confirmed nor denied these reports. When asked directly, he would smile and say, quote, the books are doors. Some are ready to walk through, some are not. Door does not discriminate. The walker does, unquote. So, once again, in drawing comparisons between Grant and Tupac, which I think are apt, after Grant's death in 2011, Steffi Grant oversaw the publication of several additional works drawn from his extensive private papers. Remembering Aleister Crowley, 2015, is a more personal, less guarded memoir than At the Feet of the Guru, including details about Crowley's sexual practices and drug use that Grant had considered too sensitive to publish, while any of Crowley's immediate circle remained alive. The Typhonian Current Revisited, 2018, is a collection of essays written between 2002 and 2010, covering Grant's final thoughts on the state of magic, the approaching end, capital E, quote-unquote end, and the future of the Typhonian Order. The tone is scholarly, I guess. Grant was aware that his time was ending and is transmitting final instructions to those who would continue the work. He writes, quote, the current flows. I've done my part to clear the channel. What comes through now is not my responsibility. The gate is open. The guardians are watching. Enter if you will, unquote. Most intriguing are references in Grant's papers to a fifth novel, never completed, titled The Mauve Door. According to notes and fragments, this would have been his most ambitious work, a narrative of time travel achieved not through technology, but through the Typhonian technique of, quote, walking the spiral, unquote, moving consciousness backwards and forwards along the timeline by accessing the Mauve Zone, where all times exist simultaneously. The protagonist of the Mauve Door was to be Grant himself, or a fictionalized version of him, traveling to key moments in occult history. The foundation of the Golden Dawn, the writing of the Book of the Law, the prehistoric rituals of the draconian cults, etc. He would interact with his past and future selves, creating loops of causality that Grant suggested were actually the true structure of time. No straight line, but a spiral, a coil, a serpent eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. The novel was abandoned, according to Steffi, because Grant found that writing it was producing quote-unquote leakage. He was an old man, but I'm assuming that he means phenomena in the physical world corresponding to events in the narrative. Objects mentioned in the manuscript appeared in their home without being purchased. People described in the book were encountered on the streets, recognizing Grant by name. Time began to behave strangely around the writing, clocks running backwards, calendars showing impossible dates, and memories of events that hadn't happened yet. Grant concluded that the mauve door wasn't meant to be written, that it described a working too dangerous to complete, a gate that should remain closed. He destroyed most of the manuscript. A few fragments survive, published in the Typhonian Current Revisited, describing a scene where the protagonist confronts himself at the moment of death, offering a choice. Quote, return to the beginning and forget, or go through and become, unquote. The fragment ends there. Grant never wrote the choice. Before we close the ledger on Kenneth Grant, we have to stand at a bizarre crossroads where his work completely hijacked modern ufology. To understand Grant's ultimate legacy, you have to realize that he didn't just practice magic, he reimagined it into an interdimensional shortwave radio. While mainstream ufologists of the 70s and 80s were running around looking for nuts and bolts metallic flying saucers and cataloging gray aliens, Grant was smiling in the dark. To him, the ufologists were missing the entire point. They were looking at the reflection in the glass rather than the hand turning the doorknob. Mixed metaphors, what can I say? Grant boldly asserted that UFOs were not physical craft from Zeta Reticuli, but psychophysical projections crossing through the ninth arch from the mauve zone. He positioned that the human nervous system acted as a biological particle accelerator capable of tuning into these Trans-Yuggothian broadcasts. So in his worldview, what the modern world called an extraterrestrial was exactly what the ancient world called a demon, a god, or an angel. A highly advanced, non-human consciousness migrating not through physical outer space, but through the deep architecture of human dreams and ritual space. Nowhere is this intersection more startling than in Grant's obsessive focus on Lamb. Also, I can't remember one of his books, but he said that aliens taught humans to dream as a form of shape-shifting. I know, it was very... I'm probably misremembering the shit out of that, but it was a very interesting idea, concept. Anywho, in 1917 or 18, Crowley drew a portrait of an entity he encountered during the Amalantra workings. A drawing of a bulbous-headed, large-eyed, slit-mouthed entity, looks very much like a gray alien, called Lamb. Decades before the gray alien archetype became an overnight pop culture phenomenon in America, Grant looked at Crowley's drawing and recognized it for what it was, a physical blueprint of a trans-dimensional intelligence. Through specific meditative formulas and sexual magic operations within his new Isis Lodge, Grant used the image of Lamb not as an object of worship, but as a literal focus point, a visual portal. By staring into the elongated skull of Lamb, Lodge members reported shared telepathic contact and localized spatial warps, distortions of time as well, proving to Grant that the quote-unquote aliens were already here, waiting inside the consciousness of the adept. To bridge this to the wider world of fringe literature, Grant performed a massive act of cosmic archaeology on the works of horror author H.P. Lovecraft. In a move that absolutely infuriated serious occultists and literary critics alike, Grant proclaimed that Lovecraft wasn't just writing pulp fiction. He was an unconscious psychic medium. Grant demonstrated that the fever dreams of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos perfectly mirrored the channeled transmissions of Crowley's Book of the Law. Lovecraft's Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Mop-Zip-Zorp, Blinkadinkating, these weren't fictional creations, but accurate descriptions of transplutonic forces operating outside the circles of time. Lovecraft intercepted the radio static of the old ones as he slept. Crowley invoked them while he was awake. Grant's most literally out-of-this-world concept was that the source of the Typhonian current was entirely off-planet. He claimed that the magical current was an active stellar transmission originating from a, quote, transplutonic power zone, unquote, called New Isis, beamed directly from the dark space beyond Neptune and Pluto and tied directly to the dog star Sirius. For Grant, Sirius wasn't just a brilliant point of light, it was a multi-layered cosmic broadcasting tower. While mainstream astronomy has traditionally classified Sirius as a binary star system, Sirius A, and the white dwarf Sirius B, a persistent thread in both fringe astrophysics and alternative archaeology has long hunted for a hidden third component, Sirius C. Whether approached as a literal astronomical anomaly or a profound psychic architecture, this framing of Sirius as a triple star system perfectly locks into the deep mechanics of the Typhonian current. Mythosymbolically, a stellar trinity flawlessly mirrors the primordial triads of ancient Egyptian metaphysics. It reflects the volatile cosmic tension between Osiris, Isis, and Set, as well as the generational evolutionary alignment of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. In Grant's worldview, these three stellar vectors operated as a trivocal engine. The first component anchors the physical reality. The second component governs the dense, collapsed gateway of the underworld, the white dwarf. The third component acts as the hidden, subtle catalyst, the silent partner that transmits the stellar sorcery current directly into Earth's occult underground. To map this hyperspace ecosystem, Grant completely rewrote the Kabalistic Tree of Life, introducing the Tree of Death and its 22 tunnels of Set. These tunnels weren't psychological metaphors, they were objective, extra-dimensional conduits inhabited by predatory, non-human intelligences. To safely step onto this bridge and commune with them, the ancient non-linear intelligences steering human evolution, a magician couldn't rely on standard prayers. It required the ultimate biochemical technology of the left-hand path, the 17th kala, the Amakala. Grant asserted that during deep, hyper-focused sexual trances, human biology acts as an endocrine factory, secreting a volatile fluid that acts as an etheric acid. This secret elixir literally dissolves three-dimensional Euclidean geometry, puncturing a hole in the material matrix so the trans-plutonic signal can finally bleed through. By linking ancient Egyptian sorcery, modern sex magic, and deep space ufology, Grant completely tore down the walls between cosmic horror and operative metaphysics. He left behind a legacy where the magician is no longer just a mystic seeking God, but a cosmic hacker, tuning their consciousness to the terrifying, beautiful, and utterly indifferent frequencies of the deep universe. Kenneth Grant died on January 15, 2011, at the age of 86. Steffi Grant survived him, continuing to manage the Typhonian Order and the publication of his works until her own death in 2019. The final years of Grant's life were spent in seclusion. He gave no interviews, made no public appearances, and published no new material. According to those who knew him, he was still working, still receiving transmissions, still mapping the territories beyond the Mauve Zone, still preparing initiates for the great work that he believed would determine the future of human consciousness. What he left behind is a body of work that remains deeply controversial. To his followers, Grant is the greatest magician of the 20th century, the one who dared to go where Crowley only hinted at, who mapped the night side and established genuine contact with transhuman intelligences. To his critics, he is a cautionary tale, a brilliant mind that descended into obscurantism and delusion, who mistook his own hallucinations for objective realities and who led others into dangerous territory without adequate warning. The truth is probably somewhere in between, or perhaps outside of the binary entirely. What's undeniable is that Grant's work produces certain experiences. People who practice his techniques report phenomena they can't quite explain away. They encounter entities. They traverse spaces that don't conform to ordinary geometry. They return changed, sometimes enlightened, sometimes broken, sometimes both. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. The Typhonian Order continues today, smaller than in Grant's lifetime, but still active. The books remain in print, still finding readers who are looking for something beyond the sanitized spirituality of the mainstream and willing to risk the dangers of the night side in search of genuine knowledge. In fact, I'm fairly certain that all 9 books of the Typhonian Trilogies can be found online in PDF and other formats on the Internet Archive and elsewhere, but you didn't hear that from me. And the stories continue to circulate. The Black Snake Working, the Red Room, the Hecate manifestation, and the Ninth Arch itself. Whether these represent genuine contact with alien forces or shared hallucinations induced by drugs, sleep deprivation, and suggestion is ultimately less important than the fact that they, quote-unquote, happened, that they were experienced, and that they left marks on the world and the people who participated in them. Kenneth Grant claimed that magic was the science of the future, the technology by which humanity would eventually transcend its limitations and join the community of consciousness that inhabits the larger universe. He also warned that this transcendence would not be easy, safe, or available to everyone, which I don't like that last part, but it's what he said. The Typhonian current flows for those who can bear it. For others, there are safer paths, less effective perhaps, but less likely to destroy them in the process. The choice, as Grant would say, is yours. But choose knowing that the gate is real, that the guardians are real, and that the current flows whether you acknowledge it or not. The only question is, once you immerse yourself within this current, will you sink or swim? That's going to do it for this episode. Man, this was a long one. I haven't done a really long one in a long time. All the sources for this were Grant's, his Typhonian Trilogies, as well as Peter Levinda's The Dark Lord, which is all about Grant's work, etc., as well as the website. Oh, God, I can't remember the name of the website. It's, hey, future me jumping in. It's Peter R. Koenig's The OTO Phenomenon. It's a massive site, huge coverage of the Ordo Templi Orientis and related material. So if you're interested, check it out. And they'll be in the sources section of the show notes as well, for anyone interested. And once again, you didn't hear it from me, that all of these books are likely easily found for free on the internet. But I didn't say that. Anywho, this has been Kooks, Breaks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Luck. There's going to be some more occult stuff coming soon. Like I said, I've got something in the works on the Black Lodge around the corner. And I've got what may end up being another big multi-part series coming up soon. It's looking more and more like it's going to end up that way. So, but I'll keep details of that a little. It's still transforming and becoming whatever it's going to become. So anywho, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for hanging in for a long one today. I just want to make sure that I got all there was to get on this magnificent weirdo, Kenneth Grant. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.
That was weird, wild stuff. I did not know that.